Hi, everyone, and welcome to Figma. Today, I'm going to quickly take you through all of the essentials that you'll need to start designing in Figma. Um, to quickly explain what Figma is, it's a web-based app made for interface design. It can be used for things like web design, digital and social ad design, presentation design, or even things like mood boarding or whiteboarding as a team. It's a really free and sort of expressive app. You can do lots of different things. It's easy to just play around and get started and making some fun stuff. So when you open up the app, the first thing that you'll see is your recent files, your drafts. All of your files are accessible in this left-hand panel. Down here, you'll see your teams. So a team you might make for a class or a workplace, and you can invite different people to your team so you can all collaborate live on files. Excuse me. Everything in Figma is online. It's all on the cloud. So all of my files, all of the images in my files, rather than a program like InDesign where everything is linked, it's all sort of stored in the cloud. So that means that I can access my files anywhere that I go, anywhere where I can access Figma, I can log in and view and edit my projects. It also means, because it's online, that similar to something like Google Docs or any online cloud-based software, I can work with my peers or my coworkers in a file together live in real time. So we can be working on a project at the same time, making edits, bouncing ideas off of each other all at once. It's a really fun sort of collaborative playground of a program, and I can't wait for you all to learn more about it. So let's get started by up here in our top right corner, clicking New Design File. You can also make a new file by clicking this little plus button up here in your sort of tab window, but I'll click here, New Design File. All right, so it's just going to open a big white space. So some of this should feel familiar to you from other programs that you've used. If you've used anything like Adobe XD or Sketch, Figma should feel really familiar to you. There's a lot of similar tools, and the entire thing is laid out really similarly. So for those of you that have experience with those programs, it's going to be really intuitive to pick up Figma and get moving right away. For people who are new to Figma, there might be some slight adjustments to make from Adobe programs, but overall, Figma is a really streamlined and simple program that allows you to create really robust designs, but the tools that they've included are really pared back, and they've just included like the absolute essentials of what you need to design successfully. So to orient us to this space a little bit, on the left-hand side here, you can see our layers panel. You should be familiar with layers from programs like Photoshop. Up here at the very top is where all of our tools are. All of our creation tools and design tools live right here. You can see here, this is my file name and the folder that it lives in. So I can quickly click on Untitled and change that to something like Figma Tutorial, just to keep my files nice and organized. And then over here, we can see a share mode. This is how I can invite other people to the file, invite other people to view the file. This button right here that turns on dev mode, which is for website developers. And this play button, which turns on presentation mode. Then in our right-hand bar, we have what is basically like a properties area like you might see in any other design program. Right now, it looks pretty empty, but as we start to add elements to our page and design things, the information in this section will change to accommodate whatever it is that we're editing. So the first thing that you're going to need to learn about Figma is the frame tool, which I can access by clicking on this little crosshatch symbol right here, or by pressing the F key for frame. A frame in Figma is kind of like an artboard from Illustrator and a text frame or an image frame from InDesign. It's like if they combined and merged. So when I make a frame, not only is that going to be my live design area, but I can also create a frame within a frame to then put additional content into. So you'll see in my layer panel here, my large frame, which kind of functions like an artboard. You can see it here. I can collapse it just like I can layers in other programs. And then inside of it, I have another frame. And if I wanted to create a frame inside of that frame, I could do that. And you can see they're all nested inside of each other. For now, let me delete these. A really handy tool that Figma has when I have my frame tool selected, it's going to have a bunch of preset sizes over in my properties panel for me to choose from. This means I don't have to worry about getting the exact size right. I can just click desktop here, and it's going to make me a frame that is exactly standard desktop size, which is 1440 by 1024 pixels. So now that I've got this going, I'm ready to start adding some elements. I've got my main frame, so let's go through our different shape creation tools and how each of those work, and then we'll also get a little bit into our properties panel over here as we do that. So if I click my shape tool area over here, the primary shape tool is the rectangle. If I want to access other shapes, I can click on this little caret drop down and it'll give me all of these options. This is also where placing an image or a video lives in Figma. It all lives in this shape drop down. So let's start with a rectangle. I can click and drag to create a rectangle of any size. And just like other programs, if I hit Shift, it'll lock my proportions to a perfect square. If I have my rectangle tool selected, which is also R, and I just click, it'll by default make a 100 by 100 pixel square for me. So no matter how many times I click with it, it'll always make that size. So with this rectangle I made selected, when I have an object selected, you can see over here in my properties panel, all of these values appear. When I unselect it, they're not there. So whatever I actively have selected is going to affect what properties show up in my panel. So I can see the X and Y coordinates here. This is where my shape falls in relation to the frame overall. So it falls 71 pixels in and 73 pixels down. If I shift this to be higher, you can see it moves further from the left edge of my frame. And same with the Y. If I make this higher, it'll shift down in my frame. So let's set this to an even 100 for both. Then my width and height here, this controls, as you might guess, the width and height of my shape. I can lock my proportions with this constrain proportions button here, but I'm just going to click this up to 1 pixel higher, so we have an even 300. And lastly, in this top area, we're going to see a rotation control, which I can also control by hovering over my corners and clicking and dragging. And then this, let me set this to 0. This is my corner radius. So this is how I'm going to create rounded edges on something like a square. And you can see as I get higher and higher, eventually it turns into a circle. Something else that you can do, I can click this sort of exploded independent corners button. And if I click that, I can see that I have 4 separate corner controls. So if I only wanted to round one corner, my top right corner, I could do that. But we're just going to leave this as a square for right now. Here you can see my layer controls. If I click on this, this is going to give me all of those layer blending modes that I'm used to from Photoshop programs. My fill, predictably, controls the fill of my color. So let's make our square red. The stroke, if I click the plus button here, will add a stroke effect to the square. I'm going to make it like a purpley blue, and here I can control the thickness of my stroke. I can use this 100% right here or this slider here to control the opacity of my stroke. And then I can also control whether it falls on the center line of my shape, on the inside or the outside of my shape. And similar to the corner control we looked at before, I can decide if I want a stroke to be on all 4 sides of my shape or just to be on the top, the bottom, the left, or the right. Something that you can do in Figma is add multiple fills or strokes to an object. So if I wanted to, I could click this plus button right here, and it'll add another fill sort of layer to my rectangle, to my square that I've made. So then if I click on this and I make it blue, and if I make the opacity 100%, now it just looks like I have a blue square because I have a fully opaque blue fill on top of a red fill. But as I drag my transparency slider down, you can see it starts to turn purple and then red as the transparency increases, or the opacity decreases, I should say. I can also then apply a blending mode just to this fill layer. Or let's make it a gradient just so we can really see the effect. So if I add another fill to my shape, I can click here, and then I can switch from a solid fill over here to a gradient fill. And by default, it's applied this linear gradient, which is perfect. I'll make it light blue just for fun. And then using this little eyedropper tool inside of this fill flyout window, you can see it's the same as the eyedropper in my layer blending mode sort of panel here. I can click on this blend mode, and I can change the blend mode of just this fill layer. So as I scroll through, I can start to see the different effects that might have. But I kind of liked this teal effect that I'm getting from multiply. So let's keep that there. If I wanted to get rid of that or just turn it off, I could click on my visibility button here. It would turn off my fill, or I can press this minus button to totally delete it. So the same thing goes for a stroke. I could add another stroke if I wanted to. So let's do that. Let's click here. Let's make my opacity 100% for this added stroke and pick a different color, maybe a dark green. And give this one a gradient fill as well. But we're going to change the direction of that with our controls here. Cool. So now I've got a fun, funky thing going on where we've got some layers of fill with gradients and blending modes, and then the same sort of layered effect happening with our stroke. Down here in our effects panel, this is going to allow you to add a few really simple effects like drop shadow, inner shadow, and then some different blurring effects. But I'll keep a drop shadow for now. If I want to change my drop shadow style, I can click on this little sun here, and I can change the position of it using the X and Y coordinates, and I can blur it more or less. So you start to notice in Figma, in these sort of different properties that you can add and change, that you can control layers, you can add multiple effects, and then you can get into the details of changing those effects and applied colors by clicking on this like leftmost column here that has my fill colors, it has my little sun icon to control the drop shadow. And then over here is how I control the actual layering of those things. So let's say I wanted to change the order of some of these effects. Let's say I wanted to have a red color burn on top of a normal teal gradient. So I could change my blending modes to be what I want. And then if I hover over the leftmost side here, I can see this little hamburger menu pops up, and my cursor turns into the white glove. So if I click and hold that now, I can reorder the layer of my different fills. So let's change this to color burn. And now I have the effect that I want. Okay, so to quickly go through the rest of the shape tools, we have a line tool, which creates a basic stroke. You can click and drag while holding shift to create perfect 45-degree angles or horizontal or vertical lines, or you can release shift to draw the line any way you want. This is just going to create a stroke. You can see here it defaults to just being a 1-point black stroke. I'll make it larger so we can see it. Looks great. The next tool in here is the arrow tool. So, oopsie, if I click on the arrow, this is going to automatically draw me a stroke that has an arrow on one end. Really useful for making things like flow diagrams or for leaving notes pointing to different pieces of your designs. Next up is the ellipse tool, the circle tool. If I click and drag, I can make an ellipse of any size. And if I hold shift, same as our rectangle tool, it'll make a perfect circle. Let's change our color there just for fun. And then we've got a polygon tool. By default, this will make a triangle. But then here in our properties window, you can see here these 4 dots with the number 3. This will control how many sides our polygon has. So we can increase the count to be as high as we want, really, and it'll just keep adding sides. Then lastly, we have our star tool. This will make a 5-pointed star by default, but similar to our polygon tool, we can control our count of points. Here, we can make it a 12-pointed star. And then this vertex ratio tool here, this will control how wide our angle is on our star, so we can create more of like a badge effect or something that looks more like an explosion or a beam of light based on the ratio of our angles in the star. Lastly, as far as shape creation goes, there's the pen tool and the pencil tool. These work just like they do in Illustrator. The pen letting you make Bezier curves and the pencil just letting you draw freeform and turning them into different paths that then you can apply a stroke or a fill to. There we go. And let's give that a fill. Awesome. I will note that Figma's pen tool and in general illustration capabilities are not as robust as a program like Illustrator. But that being said, you definitely can use Figma to draw shapes with the pen tool or to draw icons. It is totally possible. So now that I've made all of these, I can see, similar to layers in Photoshop, that all of my shapes are living within my frame here in my layers panel. You know, if I were to drag my red circle on top of my square, and if I wanted the order to change, just like layers in Photoshop, I can just click and drag and rearrange the order. Oopsie. I can rearrange the order of my objects in my layer panel here. So the last thing that I want to show you how to create is type. You can go to your type tool up here, or by pressing T, you can access the type or the text tool. And similar to Illustrator, you can add type as easily as just clicking and starting to type. Or more like InDesign, you can click and drag and create a frame for your text to live in. Let's make my type a little bigger using my properties panel over here. You should find pretty robust type controls similar to other programs. We have line spacing, letter spacing, paragraph spacing. And then if I click on this little 3-dot window here, I have even more controls over my type if I need them. So when I click on this, I can see my text box enclosing my font. Because this is a text frame, if I click on my rightmost edge here and I drag it in, similar to InDesign, it is going to knock my font down to the next line based on the width of my text frame. So the last thing that's really important to know for Figma is all of your alignment tools. You should be familiar with these from other design programs, but in Figma, they just work in a slightly different way and they live in a much more accessible place. So if I select one of my shapes or any object in my frame, up here at the tippy top of the properties window, you're going to see all of our different align icons that we're used to from the other programs. While I only have one object selected, All of these controls will affect this object in relation to my larger frame. So if I click on Align Horizontally Centered, it's going to snap my object to be perfectly aligned with the center, the horizontal center or the vertical center of my frame for either of these options. If I go to either edge, it's going to snap to any edge of my frame as well. So this is a really helpful way to easily move objects around your frame or to ensure that they're perfectly centered. Then, once I select two objects or more, these controls automatically know that I have multiple objects selected. And when I use these alignment tools, instead of aligning to the frame, it'll work a little bit more like you're used to. The objects will align to each other. There we go. The other thing to know along with alignment is the distribution tool in Figma. So to show you this, I'm going to get rid of some of my extra objects here. And we'll just have our circle. We'll make 3 red circles. So let's say I wanted to know that all of these circles were exactly the same distance apart. Well, there's a really easy way I can do that. If I select all of them, the quickest way is if they're not equally spaced, Figma is going to show me this little hamburger down here, the tidy button. And if I click on that, it's just going to automatically assume the spacing that I want between each object and make it perfectly equal. The other way I can do this is in this top properties panel. I can click this drop down and I can click tidy up, or I can click specifically to distribute the vertical or horizontal spacing. So I'll click tidy up just because I know what that'll do. And now, as I have all these objects selected, you can see when I hover over them, I have these pink circles, and then I also have these pink dashes in between my objects. So let me quickly change the color of these just to illustrate what happens. So if I have all of these selected, I can use these pink circles to quickly toggle and swap the order of objects. So let's say I wanted the yellow circle to be first. I could grab the yellow circle and just click and drag it up and change the order. Similarly, I can click it and drag it to the bottom, and the objects will rearrange themselves accordingly. These pink dashes control the space between two objects. So as I hover over it, you can see there's a little pink 125, which means there's 125 pixels between these objects. And if I click and drag, I can really easily shrink or increase that distance. Another place to find this, again, is in your properties window. You'll see this sort of sandwich looking icon here that if I increase the space, it'll increase the space between the objects. And then the same thing goes for horizontal spacing as well. I have my sideways sandwich icon here that I can use to increase the space. Now that you know the basic tools of Figma, like the frame tool, the shape tool, the type tool, and all of our different properties in our sidebar panel here, you should be ready to go to start making some awesome designs in Figma.